Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of our college football rankings. This week we're going to be talking about week two, everything that happened last week in week one with our rankings, how teams went up and down. We have some new teams in the top 25. We have some teams that have fell off. So with that being said, let's just get right into it. This episode will probably be shorter as we keep going on. There'll be probably shorter episodes than last week. Last week we just had our full season predictions, so we wanted to get those out there. But starting off with this week, starting off at the 25 spot, I have Clemson, who fell 16 spots this week. If you guys watched that game versus Duke, they got absolutely rocked. They got beat that whole game. But if you're watching the game too, if you just take away all those red zone drives that they have, which they fumbled on 3 drives, they looked good overall. I still think they're a top 25 team at this spot. And I mean, the other teams we have left are Iowa, who beat Utah State by 10. And then we have teams like Coastal Carolina, Arkansas, or TCU that would be in this spot. I still think Clemson is the best team overall out of those teams. Will Shipley looked really good overall. And like I said, it was going to come down to quarterback play. And the team overall, there was a lot of fumbles too, but they just didn't look that great overall. But I still do think they're in the 25 spot.
Yeah, and I have Clemson in my 24 spot, so I'll talk about him a little bit too. I had high expectations for Cade Klubnik. I know he's been up and down in the few times we've seen him. Obviously, he was behind DJ for a long time at Clemson, or I guess a year. But with that being said, I mean, he looked all right, but he didn't put it together the way I would want him to. He went like 17 for 30, 17 for 31. It's just when you're playing against a team like Duke that you expect to go out and beat pretty well, they were favored by like 2 touchdowns in this game. You expect a higher completion percentage. And I think a lot of it has to do with Garrett Riley as well. Obviously, his first year offensive coordinator for the Tigers. And he was supposed to refresh this offense that really needed it. And they kind of looked flat at times. I think Will Shipley is going to be Will Shipley. In my opinion, he's one of the best running backs in the country. So I expect him to show out and do well. But just with fumbles and miscues, I mean, you can leave it up to Klubnik. I think a lot of it's going to be on Riley, and a lot of it's going to be on Coach Dabo as well. When it comes to Duke, I do want to give them credit, and we'll talk about them later. But Duke played a great game. I don't think it was necessarily Clemson at their worst. Obviously, they weren't at their best. But Duke came out and looked really good. And, we both have them ranked. You can see it on the screen. We'll mention them a little bit more later. But I think Duke was more impressive than Clemson was disappointing, in my opinion.
Yeah. Next up, we'll just go through this one quickly. I have Tulane at 24. You have them at 23. They beat South Alabama. They have Ole Miss coming up this week. We'll talk about that a little more as we talk about Ole Miss. But it's a big test for both sides. No movement from either side. We both have them in the same spot as last week, but a team that we can talk a lot about, the team that has been looked at the most out of all college football teams, the most bet on team last week overall, is Colorado. This team had a lot of hype going into the season and is still the biggest liability to Vegas at this point. If they came out and won the national championship, somehow the sports books are just completely done. But that being said, going into this game, Shedeur Sanders, 510 yards with 4 touchdowns. Dylan Edwards, who hasn't been talked about enough, had a fantastic game with 4 touchdowns. And Travis Hunter, who people kind of forgot that was the #1 overall recruit just because he went to an HBCU last year with Shedeur Sanders. They just didn't really get talked about as much as they are now, but goes out there and performs on both sides of the ball. And this team just looked great. I have them in my 23 spot. I know you have them in your 25 spot. So talking about that, I just want to hear your thoughts about this team overall.
Yeah, and I feel the same way that you do. This team looked absolutely incredible last week, especially with TCU's offense kind of firing at a very high clip. And Colorado was able to keep up the whole game. Obviously, got some big points before halftime. They just looked fresh out there. They looked ready to roll. And I think this kind of is going to be a defining moment for the new transfer portal rules we see. I know a lot of people don't like the transfer portal. They think it's, now that guys have instant eligibility, it might be abused or, that's how some people feel. But I think Coach Prime is showing that teams can get a lot of transfers, start mostly transfers, and succeed. At the end of the day, these guys just know how to play football. It's not really about experience or, how long you've been at the college. It's about playing ball. And Coach Prime puts out the lineup that he thinks can do it the best. Obviously, his son, Shedeur, absolutely incredible. You don't get 510 yards by mistake. That's just incredible quarterback play. And as you mentioned, Dylan Edwards, I mean, getting 4 touchdowns in a must-win game for Colorado. I know that sounds ridiculous to call, their first game of the season must win, but if they wanted to show that they were a real squad and get the hype that, we see they deserve, they had to go out here and beat TCU. Obviously, they were just in the national championship game. And overall, I mean, I think guys stepped up when they had to. Travis Hunter, obviously, big interception as well. This Colorado team is fun. I have them at 25 just because I think they have to be ranked. At the end of the day, I do think pretty much every other team on our list here would beat them if they squared off today. But Colorado is going to have a chance to build up a really good resume going forward, and they might be here for a while.
Yeah. And like you said, too, I mean, overall, the one thing that people really haven't been talking about too much, Travis Hunter, obviously really good on both ends. But specifically, I could definitely still see more from him offensively, which is amazing after that first game. I think he's going to go out there and have some really big games. Coming up this week, they have Nebraska, which isn't the best team, but it's a competitive Big Ten team. And they were supposed to lose this next game. They were 7-point underdogs, but after that win, now they're 3.5-point favorites. So this will be a very interesting game going into this week. And like you said, they didn't go out there and just blow out TCU. They went in there against TCU, who obviously they were in the national championship last year. They did lose a lot of their good players, but they still kept a good amount. And they went out there and they outdueled them. And Shedeur Sanders, if he can keep this going, he will be in our Heisman rankings within the next few weeks if he can keep this up. And we could see Travis Hunter up there too. I mean, we haven't seen a defensive and offensive player like this in a long time, but this will be a very fun team to watch going forward. And then at number 22, we both have Duke. We talked about them a little earlier, but they took down Clemson thanks to Riley Leonard and company. And they take on Lafayette this next week, and it keeps the ball rolling for them. This is going to be a good win last week coming into this week to show how good they are against Lafayette. And Riley Leonard, they were talking about a little bit on the broadcast. He's starting to remind me a little bit of Daniel Jones. A few people were talking about him going into the season as a possible kind of dark horse to get drafted maybe in the second day overall. And if he can continue this rise and be good this year, just like Daniel Jones was, he had that same progression where people were talking about him a little bit, but then he goes into his senior year and he plays very well in a year where the number one quarterback spot is already kind of locked away. But after that, there's a lot of guys, and Riley Leonard could put his name in that hat to be within that second, third, fourth quarterback taken, because there's going to be a lot of teams that need a quarterback. But Duke overall had a great week, and coming up against Lafayette, I think they're going to go out there and play really well too to keep that ball rolling.
Yeah, and just to talk a little bit more about this Duke team we saw last week. Obviously, Riley Leonard is the big name. Getting almost 100 yards on the ground to mix with a passing game where he was pretty effective. That doesn't happen by chance. That was just an incredible game, obviously, against a Clemson defense that I expected pretty solid things out of. But with that being said, I want to talk about the defensive side of the ball as well, because ACC teams don't usually get held up to 7 points, especially not a team like Clemson. And that's exactly what Duke did. And that's because of a guy named Chandler Rivers. Chandler Rivers is the team's middle linebacker, big number 0. And he was all over the place in that game. He ended up with 11 tackles, 7 of them solo. And he was just a difference maker. If he continues a season like this, we could be looking at like ACC Defensive Player of the Year type stuff, and that gets you drafted. So I really like Chandler Rivers. I think he was a great factor. He's going to be the X factor going forward. They play Lafayette next week. I think if he shows up, has another big game, Duke's going to be here for a while longer in our ranking. So I thought that was a great game from Duke overall.
Yeah, Duke kind of on that same trajectory that we could see with Tulane. Two teams that are kind of lower now, but if they keep it rolling, then we can keep having them on this list. And the next two teams that we have are Texas A&M and Ole Miss. As you guys see on the screen, we have them flip-flopped, but talking about them real quick, Texas A&M, they look good versus New Mexico. Connor Wegman had 5 touchdowns. They take on Miami next week. That's going to be a big game for them. And Ole Miss overall, they slaughtered Mercer, but what else did we expect? Jackson Dart with almost a perfect game, 330 yards and 4 touchdowns. They take on Tulane next week, which is going to be a good game. Both of these teams looking to maybe break that top 15 overall if we see some teams lose, and whoever wins this game, one of those teams will go up. And I guess since we have them in different spots, I'm going to talk about Ole Miss a little more just because I have them a little higher. Jackson Dart had a good game last week, and he's continuing to show why I think he's one of the most underrated quarterbacks overall right now. Ole Miss is a good team overall, and that offense will continue to thrive, especially having Jackson Dart there. I think he's going to prove this year that he can really put his name in the hat for great quarterbacks overall. And that's kind of why I have them a little higher than Texas A&M. I do think they're very close, but Connor Wegman too did have a great game overall. So what else did you see from Texas A&M?
Yeah, A&M, I mean, New Mexico is not this football powerhouse, but I expected them to come out here and play a little bit of football. Obviously, A&M huge favorites, and you pretty much talked about the guy already, but Connor Wegman, just an incredible game. I mean, I have the stats right here: 18 for 23, 236 yards, 5 touchdowns, and we saw effective guys in the run game as well. Amari Daniels, Le'Veon Moss. I mean, just watching the game, they looked like a very strong team. If we're being honest, Ole Miss and A&M are two teams that are pretty even in my eyes right now. This next week, as you mentioned, is going to be the big story for both of them. If they both go out with convincing wins, then they're probably going to stay around the same spot. But they both have a lot to prove going into next week. Got some big matchups. So I like what I saw from Ole Miss as well. Jackson Dart is a legit guy. I think over the offseason, they had some QB controversy, maybe thinking about starting someone different. But as we both have been saying on this podcast, Jackson Dart is legit. I'm glad to see him find some success early. And both of these teams are solid. I like A&M just a little bit more, but it's very close.
Yeah, and a lot of these teams too that we have around these rankings, we have some of them flip-flopped. A lot of these teams we haven't really seen go out there and prove themselves completely. So with some of these bigger games coming up, we'll be able to see that. And then moving on to two more teams that we have flip-flopped, we have UNC and Wisconsin up at 18 and 19. UNC last game, despite the 2 interceptions, Drake May still looked very good against a competitive South Carolina. That was a good game to watch. They take on Appalachian State next week, so they'll try to continue to move on with that. And then Wisconsin, who I have at 18, they defeated Buffalo. Tanner Mordecai didn't play that great overall, but I still think that running back duo that they have, Braylon Allen, played great, 2 touchdowns. Ches had 2 touchdowns too. So I kind of have Wisconsin a little higher right now, even though I do think Drake May is obviously at this point better than Tanner Mordecai. I kind of just put a little more faith, especially in Wisconsin as a running team overall, but very close overall between these two teams.
Yeah, and I pretty much have the same sentiment. They're both very close in my rankings. You could flip it either way. But UNC, I was just a little bit more impressed. Obviously, they played the game a little bit closer, but they beat South Carolina. And obviously, towards the end of last season, we saw South Carolina as a team that was ranked. They weren't ranked going into the start of this season. They lost some guys. Maybe the Spencer Rattler hype has fallen off for some people. But that was going to be a close game in my eyes. And I think UNC looked pretty confident. They won by 2 touchdowns. So it just gives them the edge for me over a team like Wisconsin that showed me some stuff that made me a little nervous. I love the running backs, but they weren't going as hard as they were in the first half and the second half. So any team that runs the ball as heavily as we expect Wisconsin to is going to run into some problems. I just didn't see those problems with UNC, but at the end of the day, both of these teams are kind of in the same tier for me as well.
Yeah. And next up, a team that we have in the same spot, Oregon State. Going into this week, DJ Ungalilea, I was a little concerned on how he would play overall, just because how we saw him play at Clemson, but he went out there and he dominated. Obviously, it was against San Jose State, but still, if you're an Oregon State fan and you see that, you see where Clemson got their hopes from, and he showed that he was a good quarterback. And with Clemson not playing so great this week, a lot of people are kind of saying that he was the scapegoat for Clemson. I'm not completely sure about that yet, but I know that there's a lot of different opinions on that. But Oregon State didn't really show too much to move up, but just because teams fell down a little bit, we do have them moving up.
Yeah, and I just want to mention, I like Damian Martinez, their running back, quite a bit. He had 18 carries, 145 yards. That's, like an 8-yard average. I think he looked really good. Obviously, we mentioned San Jose State. They don't have the most incredible run defense in the country, but nice to see him and DJ both have big games when they have to. If you're a good team, you got to beat these squads that aren't really on your level convincingly, and that's what the Beavers did. So I thought it was a pretty solid game all around.
Yeah, another team we have in the same spot is Oklahoma. We have them at 16. Going into this week, both of us, we had a big question on how Dylan Gabriel would play. Went out there with 300 yards and 2 touchdowns, only 3 incompletions, and they spread the ball a lot across the offense, which is always good to see in week 1. A lot of times we don't see teams have their big receiver have a huge game, especially if they're playing against a lower level team like this. Going into this game, they won 73-0. They just dominated everywhere in the running game and the passing game. So it's good to see him get a bunch of different looks overall. And they're still kind of looking to fill that role that Marvin Mims left. He was their top receiver last year, but by spreading the offense around, that helps them a lot. And going against SMU next week, that'll help them figure it out even more, as I expect Dylan Gabriel to have another good game.
Yeah, and Dylan Gabriel looked great. Another storyline I saw, though, was that when he came out, the team's up by 60-some points at this time. Jackson Arnold goes in, and he looks great. I mean, he had 100% completion percentage, over 100 yards, threw a touchdown. So even if Dylan Gabriel isn't the answer this year, I think Oklahoma fans could be happy knowing that Jackson Arnold probably will be that guy to step up. I don't want to take it away from Gabriel, though. He looked fresh. He looked good. So Oklahoma, I mean, they're on an up trajectory for me. You beat a team by 70. I don't really care who it is. It's a pretty good look for you.
Yeah, and another team to look out for as we go forward. Next up in my 15 spot, I have Kansas State. And then I think this week, I know you have them a little hot. You have them at 14, but just talking about them real quick. Will Howard, he had a rushing, passing, and receiving touchdown in the first half overall, which is kind of crazy to see from a quarterback. They take on Troy next week. They moved up 2 spots for me with teams going down. So another team kind of close to that Oklahoma area where they could be a wild card team to watch out for if they can continue to roll on some wins.
Yeah, for sure. And when we talked about it last week, I mentioned Kansas State as a team. I really want to see what their running game looks like. It looked great. SEMO, obviously, again, another team that's not a football powerhouse. I actually liked what their quarterback was doing. I watched that game. I think SEMO has some guys on that team, but still got absolutely smacked by 45. Good game from Kansas State. I like them. I moved them up like 2 or 3 spots, if I remember correctly. I just liked what I saw. So they're up there for me for sure.
Next up, I have Oregon at the 14 spot. They killed Portland State overall. Bo Nix had a great performance that he does. He's building up his Heisman hype back up. They take on Texas Tech next week. So Texas Tech, not really ranked right now, but still a good competition for them, especially after watching their game last week. And Bo Nix does what he does every year. He's building up this Heisman hype. But this time, if he can keep the train rolling, this Oregon team is going to be dangerous this season. It just depends on if or when the rails fall off.
Yeah, and that's going to go for another team we talk about later in Texas. I feel very similar, but just to keep it on Oregon for a little bit. I mean, Portland State, it felt like they barely had the ball in this game. It felt like it was Oregon running offense in practice over and over again. They just looked solid. I think, this goes for when we're talking about Oklahoma, when we're talking about some of these other teams that blew squads out. Oregon, if you drop 81 in a game, that's impressive to me no matter who it is. They could do it against high schoolers, and I think it would be pretty solid. So Bo Nix, I mean, you can't deny he had a good game. I know we both have our opinions on Bo Nix. I know we might think he's a little fraudulent, but I mean, that's a good start. That's the type of start you want to see for someone that is making a Heisman push. So as the season goes on, I mean, this is just going to be added stats to his resume to a certain extent. So I think Oregon fans are just fine with that.
Yeah. Next up, we have Utah, who last week we talked about. They played Florida, and we talked about that last week. So not really much to talk about now. I have them moving up 1 spot at 13. I know you have them at 15. They take on Baylor, so they might be able to move up again next week. But big team that we're going to talk about now, LSU, I have them in the 12 spot. You have them in the 13. Last week, I made it very clear that this team is a very boom or bust team overall. And going into the second half, it was going to be a very competitive game against Florida State, who was a good team. And then it just got very ugly very quickly. Overall, Jaden Daniels, I don't think played that bad. I know we've gotten a lot of flack for keeping him in our Heisman race, but like I said before, this team is boom or bust. And I think overall, I mean, I have them at 12. You have them at 13. They're going to win the next few weeks against some easy competition. They have Grambling this week. They're going to beat them by 60 points. Jaden Daniels could throw 5 touchdowns, and everyone's going to get back on the hype train. Give them 3 weeks, and LSU is going to be back in the top 10 again, and people are going to keep talking about that, especially if you're losing to a team that Florida State ranked within the top 6, even the top 3 for some people. Some people were arguing they should be the number 1 ranked team this week. You can't really say that LSU completely lost this season at this point if they just lost to one of the best teams in college football. So I'm still high on LSU. And I still think Jaden Daniels will be able to bounce back from this.
Yeah, and I see what you're saying for sure. We have been getting a lot of heat. Make sure to check out our Instagram or TikTok if you want to see our Heisman rankings. But I think we both agree Jaden Daniels definitely still deserves to be up there. I don't think that he's the reason they lost the game. I mean, putting up 24 against Florida State is definitely respectable. But this LSU team, I don't think is a team that's necessarily going to be right back in that playoff contention. Top 10, sure. But they have games against Arkansas and Ole Miss. And although LSU is probably a better team than those guys, SEC matchups are no joke. And I actually like what I saw from Arkansas last week. That's a team I wanted to mention that didn't make my list. I actually think they might be kind of close. KJ Jefferson's a really solid quarterback. But point is with LSU, they played against Florida State, who's also one of the best teams in the country. Obviously, we've mentioned them and we'll talk about them more in a little bit. But I don't hate everything I saw. I think they need to get the running game going much more. And in that second half, Florida State just made all the right adjustments and came out firing. And when you're going against a guy like Jordan Travis, who's also in our Heisman rankings, you can't let your defense slip and fall behind. And if you do, you got to make things a shootout. And that's just not the style of ball LSU was playing last night or, last game. So there's a lot of things to talk about there. I think LSU is going to be a team that could have some shakeup. I like how you say boom or bust because they could make the playoffs or they could be out of this list pretty soon. A lot of things to say about that Tigers team. I just want to give them more time.
Yeah, next up, in my 11th spot, I have Notre Dame. They defeated Tennessee State. We saw Sam Hartman get into our 5th spot overall. He had a great game. Overall, I mean, this team looked good from what we've seen. They've played 2 games up to this point. They haven't really played anyone too great. So that's kind of why I'm leaving them out of the top 10 area. I know you have them at 10. I just have them on the edge. But I do think they do have a tough schedule coming up, too. They'll have Ohio State and Duke back to back. And Duke could be very high at that point in the rankings. Ohio State, Duke, USC within 3 weeks is going to be tough, and they're going to continue to build up until those games. So I think it's good that they have kind of this cupcake schedule to start. But overall, from what we've seen from Sam Hartman, he's played great. And that 5th spot we have right now is kind of up for grabs at this point, and he took it this week.
Yeah, and Notre Dame's just doing what they have to do. They're dominating in these games. They look good. Their offense is firing and their defense is shutting teams down. I mean, only let up 6 points all season. I know they're not playing against anyone great, but that's a really good sign 2 weeks in for them. And yeah, I mean, as you mentioned, their season gets real coming up in a little bit. That Ohio State, Duke, and USC stretch is going to be tough. But for now, I mean, you can't deny just the talent on the roster and the way they've been looking. They're in that 10 range. Obviously, I have them at 10, you have them at 11. But I like what I'm looking at here for Notre Dame. And if they can beat, 2 out of those 3 teams coming up, or, even if they go out and beat Ohio State first, they're probably going to be in playoff talk. So that's going to be huge for them. So I think the Fighting Irish are in a good spot, but they're going to be a way more exciting team to talk about as we move forward a couple weeks from now.
Yeah, some other teams that we have different rankings on too. I have Tennessee at 10. I know you have them at 8. And then you have Texas at 11. I have them at 8. Starting off with Tennessee, I know you have them a little higher. I was impressed by them this week overall. I still do think that I have them behind Texas and Washington, but I do see the argument for it. And that's why I want to hear you give me that argument.
Yeah, and the reason I'm so impressed with Tennessee is because and people are going to say things about Joe Milton, but I think overall the perception of Joe Milton is that he's going to be a really good quarterback this year. What I was worried about was the running game, and I know it's only Virginia, but the running game was just exactly what I'd want it to be. Jalen Wright in particular is not the guy I thought would get the bulk of the carries. He actually only got 12. Jabari Small got more, but Jalen Wright did so much more with his carries, and he was involved in the passing game as well. That impressed me heavily. And another part I want to talk about is the Tennessee defense. 13 points of Virginia is kind of whatever, but the offense and the special teams put Virginia in really good spots to capitalize on points kind of throughout the game. And Tennessee's defense didn't budge. They didn't even let up a single solid drive until the last couple minutes of the second quarter. The Volunteers just looked really good out there. And Joe Milton did what he had to do. He just effortlessly throws the ball. I know it's going to matter more when he's going against SEC competition, but he just looked like he understood the offense out there. Obviously, Tennessee does this high tempo thing where they get guys up to the line quick. They don't do a whole lot of audibles. They basically just run up and snap the ball and see what happens. And that's a system that Hendon Hooker, worked in perfectly. It doesn't work for a lot of quarterbacks. So if we're talking about Joe Milton from a couple of years ago at Michigan, this never would have been the way Joe Milton could play football. And to see him succeed, even just for 1 week in this Tennessee offense, makes me confident going forward. And it's a gimmick to a certain extent, especially with how far they spread out the offense. But it's a gimmick that beat Alabama last year and is looking just as good and if not better than last year. And last year, this was a team that was ranked number one at a certain point. So if I'm saying they look better on the offensive side of the ball and definitely better on the defensive side of the ball, I have super high expectations. It's early. There are teams that deserve to be ranked in front of them. I'm not going to put them top five or anything, but they're out of anybody we have in this range, the team I'm most confident in to make the playoffs.
Yeah. Next up, Washington, who we both have at 9. Like we saw, if you've seen our Heisman ranking so far, Michael Penix has made his way to the second overall spot, 450 yards and 5 touchdowns. The receiving room overall was great. This team is looking to make a push. They're going to keep playing well, especially against Tulsa next week. Not the best competition, so that'll go out there and that'll definitely help Michael Penix and the rest of this wide receiver room go out and continue to play well. I was impressed by the defense overall too, and with that, I mean, all that being said, Caleb Williams is still in our number 1 spot, and USC is going to continue to be good. But Michael Penix is knocking on that door slowly. Looking at the odds, they've started to change a little bit. It was a toss-up going into week 1 overall between some of the top 5, 6-ish guys. But it seems like Penix and Caleb Williams are kind of taking those top 2 spots right now. And if he's going to continue to play like this, it's going to be really tough.
Yeah, and this Huskies team is a team that just loves getting big plays, and I think that's gonna, go well for them going forward. I mean, I was looking at the stats here; they got about 10 yards per play last week against Boise State. I mean, that's kind of game breaking numbers right there, and it makes sense when your Heisman level quarterback is throwing for 450 yards and 5 touchdowns. So obviously, the production is going to slow down a little bit once they start going against some better defenses, and their defense themselves. I mean, they showed flashes, but I do worry a little bit about them. Either way, the offense is going to be high powered enough to kind of push them to some wins against some of these better teams. And once they get into Pac 12 play, the Pac 12 looked really good. So they're going to have some tough games. But I mean, this Washington team is undeniably really solid. I put them in the same tier as Tennessee for me. I think they're both teams that are going to be competing for playoff spots at some point in this season. So I loved what I saw from Penix, loved what I saw from the Huskies. Going to be a team we're definitely going to talk a lot about going forward.
And then coming up to Texas, who I have at my 8th spot, Quinn Ewers, 260 yards, 3 touchdowns. Xavier Worthy with 90 yards. A.D. Mitchell didn't get too much of the ball. He still did get a touchdown, though. And they played against Rice, who isn't the best team overall. But, I mean, they'll still probably be a bowl team this year. And JT Daniels has now lost 3 games against Texas in Texas with 3 different teams. Just a stat to throw out there. The one thing we didn't really see too much of was the running game. But I mean, they beat him by almost 30 points, and they were fine throwing the ball as much as they did. And I'd like to see Jatavion Sanders get more into it. I know he's a tight end, so especially in college football, you either have a massive game or you kind of have a low game. There's not really in between too much, especially when you have high-end receivers. But I'm very excited for the future of this team with Jatavion Sanders and A.D. Mitchell hopefully getting a little more involved. And they're taking on Alabama this week. And I'm very high on Texas, and I'm not that high on Alabama. I think this is going to be a good game overall. And I'll go into it. I'll give my call right now. I think Texas will come away with a win this week. In Alabama, I know it's going to be tough, but we saw what happened last year with a healthy Quinn Ewers. I think they're going to take this game. We'll talk a little bit more about Alabama later, though.
Texas fans already hate me. They're going to hate me more. I got Alabama by at least 2 touchdowns in that game. No chance for me. But I got to be positive a little bit. I do have Texas ranked up here high. I'll talk about the Rice game. I think their defense had a lot of contributors, which, stands out to me. I think that's a really good thing, especially for the next week you're going out and playing Alabama. And if we're talking about teams that are ranked high that play, these scrub teams, this is the type of game where guys struggle because you look at a team like Rice that has an experienced quarterback. JT Daniels, maybe not the best quarterback, but I think experience is a good word. So if he came out here and had a really stellar game, we could have seen Texas get a scare, and they completely avoided that because they played shutdown defense. 37 points is really good, don't get me wrong. Like you, I wish I saw more in the rushing game, but at the end of the day, they did what they had to do to come out here and win by over 25 points. So they look good against Rice. We'll talk about Bama later. I just don't think they're on the same level. I think we do this with Texas every year. Last year when they played Bama, they looked like they had a chance to win. So, and anything is possible. But man, we'll talk about Bama more. I think Texas is good. I don't know if Texas is that good.
Yeah, and like you said, 3 turnovers, and this momentum is going to help roll into this game. This is going to be the biggest game of the week overall. But next up at 7, we both have Penn State. The first half was very slow and should have been a lot better than it was. 2 missed kicks. That's definitely going to be something that this team has to figure out. But besides that, Drew Allar showed he's the guy. 325 yards, 3 touchdowns. Keandre Lambert-Smith had 4 receptions, 123 yards, and 2 touchdowns, which was insane. There's still a lot to figure out, especially with that kicking, but it's the first week, so there's going to be bumps in the road. But watching the game, especially live at the stadium, I didn't realize how good Drew Allar had until I watched the game back and saw the stats and realized he almost had a perfect game at that point. A little more to be seen from the running game. I know Nick Singleton had about 70 yards and a touchdown, but he's a guy who can go out there and get you 150 yards, and we saw that as a freshman. So I was hoping to see a little bit more from him overall, but there's still a lot of question marks, and I think they'll figure it out. I mean, I'm not too worried about it at this point. And with the way that Ohio State and Michigan were a little shaky in the first 2 weeks, I'm not going to say that they're going to win the Big Ten, but they did look good enough, and they looked better than those teams, even though we have them ranked higher. They're going to take on Delaware this week, so should be another big game for Drew Allar. And if he continues to put these big games up, he'll be knocking on our Heisman ranking door.
Yeah, for sure. And West Virginia is obviously not a great team, but what I do like about them is their run defense. So I expected Nick Singleton to kind of, not be on his A game. But even with that being said, 70 yards and a touchdown, especially while splitting snaps with Katron Allen, you can't complain. I think that was a great game. And Drew Allar, yeah, I mean, when watching the game, the first half seemed a little slow. I was thinking the same thing. I was kind of waiting for Allar to turn it up, but he did everything he had to do. 21 for 29, 325 yards, 3 touchdowns. I mean, that's exactly what you want to see. And Penn State, thankfully they covered. So I think they had a great game. Very happy about that. And yeah, I mean, we talk about Michigan, Ohio State, and they're teams that came out a little flat while Penn State came out and showed exactly what they're made of. So I think that's an interesting point. Going forward, they're a team that the media, the AP poll, the coaches poll is going to rank pretty high. And I think they're going to climb up both of our rankings as well.
Yeah. Next up, I have Alabama at 6, so a little lower than you. I know you have them at 3. What I saw from this first week, playing Middle Tennessee, they still beat them by almost 50, which is impressive. Like we keep said about every single game. I mean, if you beat a team by 50, that's going to be great. And Jalen Milroe looked good. He looked like a more mobile Jalen Hurts. A lot of people have been putting that comparison in there, and I agree with that. We didn't see too much of him. Only 18 attempts passing. I know they were up by a lot, so you don't really blame him for that much for running the ball. This wide receiver room is good overall with Jermaine Burton, who I'm still not happy that he left Georgia to go to Alabama, but that's his fault if he doesn't want the championship rings. Isaiah Bond, still a good wide receiver overall, 70 yards and a touchdown for him. Some good touchdowns from this team. I just need to see a little more. And going into this game against Texas, definitely a huge game for them overall. And if they can come out with a win, I will be not happy to put them in the top 5, but definitely deserve it at that point. I just need to see it happen.
Yeah, and my honest opinion is that Nick Saban's offense looks better when they have a quarterback that can move, and maybe that's why I'm so bought into Jalen Milroe. I think he's a really good player. I think he's going to find a lot of success this season, and I'm convinced he can go out there and beat Texas next week. Don't want to keep piling onto that, but the run game looked good against Middle Tennessee. It's one of those games where they get up by a lot early, so they're kind of running the clock. So we didn't see all of Milroe that I would have wanted to see. But I just think they're an incredibly talented team. I think because of how their last season went. A lot of the people that are making the polls out there, people like us that are talking about Alabama, have them a little low. But if we're just looking at this season and the success I think they're going to find, I think they're deserving of a top 4 spot. I have them in the 3. I think it's just an overall really solid team they have going forward. I would be really surprised if they lose more than like one game this season. So just for those reasons, I have them a little higher than you. I understand they haven't proven much this year at all. Only one game. So if they lose to Texas, it's going to be a big conversation, but I feel good about this Crimson Tide team going forward.
Next up, too, we both have USC at the 5 spot. Caleb Williams, 320 yards and 5 touchdowns. They take on Stanford next week. They played exactly how I expected them to play overall, and they're going to continue to be knocking on that top 4 door for that playoff spot.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I don't have too much to add to that. Caleb Williams looked great. Going against a team that's really not that great. He did exactly what he had to do. So I like this USC squad. I think they're going to be fighting for a playoff spot going forward. As I mentioned earlier, Pac-12 is really tough. Some of those games are going to be defining moments of their season. If Caleb Williams leads them to victories in those games, then it's going to be hard to deny him one of the top seeds in the playoffs this year.
Next up, Florida State. I have them at 4. You have them at 6. Big game this week, like we talked about earlier with LSU. I have them a little higher just because I had LSU at the 4 spot, so they took that 4 spot from them. They knocked down LSU to start the second half, and they continued to kick them while they were down. And Keon Coleman and Johnny Wilson looked like prime Jamar Chase and Justin Jefferson out there. That was a great game for both of those guys. Keon Coleman put his name in there. We all knew Johnny Wilson was a great receiver too. There were some questions about Coleman, though, transferring from Michigan State, and he went out there and balled. And this team was great overall. I mean, they're going to be a very tough test for any team, and I wouldn't be surprised if they continue this stretch. They should be in the playoffs by the end of the year. It is going to be tough going for that championship, but I still think this team is a top 4 team right now, and they played amazing. And that's why they have a quarterback who's in our Heisman rankings that high. Jordan Travis went out there and played exactly what he needed to do and even more, and they just looked great offensively and defensively. Jared Verse had some great pass rush. All the linebackers in that group had great pass rushing that game, and it was just an absolute great game from Florida State.
Yeah, for sure. And I just don't have them as high because I didn't have LSU that high going into the season. Obviously, I liked them. I didn't think they were the best team in the SEC or anything, though. But there's no denying that this Florida State team came out and just handled business. I think going forward, they're going to have obviously, like any of these teams towards the top, some really defining moments in their season. And if Jordan Travis leads them to those moments, then, hey, this is a team that is fighting for a playoff spot. They have the hype for it. They have the talent for it. They've been recruiting heavily the last couple of years. We haven't really seen the success. I think this is the first year we're going to see those recruits really come and make an impact. And they looked great last week. I liked what I saw. So I think they're deserving. They have to be in your top 10 at this point, if not in your top 5. I have them at 6, but they're right in that range for me.
Yeah. Next up, Michigan. I have them at 3. You have them at 4. We're probably 2 of the only people that still have them below Michigan, behind Ohio State at this point. They went out and they beat ECU. It was 30-3. You would definitely hope for a lot more, especially if you're the second ranked team in the AP poll. JJ McCarthy, I mean, he looked good overall. Blake Corum looked good. Roman Wilson caught all 3 touchdowns, and they just didn't look that amazing. But like I said before, especially in week 1, if you beat a team and by a good amount, if you only beat them by a field goal or a touchdown, then that's a different story. But they beat them by almost 30 points, and the offense is still figuring things out. So I'm not going to knock them down at this point. I'm still going to keep them in that 3 spot, because the offense played well. JJ McCarthy had a near perfect game, and so did Blake Corum. This team overall still looked good. And I mean, next week, they're going to go out there and they're going to continue to not have great competition for a little while. They're taking on UNLV, so they're going to run the score up there too, and then Bowling Green again. And they don't really need their head coach, as he's suspended right now, in air quotes, but they're still going to be fine. I can't knock them at this point.
Yeah, I had Michigan 4 last week. I have them 4 this week. I don't think they deserve to move down from the game or anything, but I wasn't super impressed. I don't know. I mean, looking at Jay McCarthy's stats, he looks incredible. 280, 3 touchdowns, incredibly high passer rating. But I mean, this Eastern Carolina team is really bad. Like they don't have a passing game to any extent. All of their successful plays came from check downs and like short runs. So I expected Michigan to go out and beat them by a very high amount, like almost 40, 50. So 27 is impressive, as you mentioned. I'm not moving teams up or down for being a team by 27 that they should beat by a little more. That's not how my rankings are going to work. But I did expect to see a more high-powered offense. The defense looked great. So I think keeping them where I had them is fair. I still like a team like Alabama more than them. And especially after the first week, seeing Alabama's offense move the way it did compared to Michigan's, I like Alabama a little bit more. But Michigan stays solid for me. 4 is a good spot, obviously a playoff spot. So still think the Wolverines are going to go out and have a really good season.
Yeah, another team kind of in that same area. Ohio State winning 23-3 against Indiana. Very slow first half from them overall. The offense didn't look fantastic, but the same thing with Michigan. In week 1, if your offense struggles, especially against a team like Indiana, it's a Big Ten competition. They may not be the best team in the Big Ten, but that's definitely better competition than playing against ECU. And I'm not going to knock them for struggling a little bit. If we get to week 3 or week 4 and they start struggling and only putting up 23 points against a team like Indiana when you're the second best, then you start to bring the questions in. But the first week they won by 20 points. And there's still a lot to be seen from this offense. Kyle McCord didn't have any touchdowns. He did have 1 interception. The running game wasn't that great, wasn't where it should be. The offense overall, the top 2 receivers, Marvin Harrison and Emeka Egbuka, didn't really do too much, but they still won the game by 20 points. And they're going to go out next week and they're going to win that game by a lot. And we'll be able to see them. They're playing against Youngstown State and they're going to beat them by probably 40 points. And then I'll feel comfortable with keeping them up there, just like Michigan. They struggled a little bit, but I'm not going to take them out of my rankings because they didn't beat them by 40.
Yeah, my biggest concern is not the passing game. I mean, we know Ohio State is going to compete this year, but I wish Marvin Harrison Jr. and Egbuka kind of got more involved in the game. I don't really care if the quarterback doesn't throw for 400 yards or anything, but I want to see him targeting his best receivers, and it's just not what we saw. Indiana is not on the same level as Ohio State. Wasn't worried about the game not going in Ohio State's way or anything, but it is something to look out for. We know Marvin Harrison Jr. is the best receiver in college football. You could argue one of the best college football receivers we've seen in a long time. And you just want to see him get involved in the game.
Yeah. The same team that we have at number 1, they haven't moved down at all. Georgia went out, they won 48-7. Not really that much to say from this team overall. Carson Beck had 300 yards. I would have liked to see a little more from the running backs, especially. I know there's a lot of injuries too, but Kendall Milton, I think he should have got more than 9 rushing attempts, especially if he's going to be this number 1 guy with the injuries. I would have hoped for a little more, but they did spread the offense around like we should see in week 1 that I was talking about earlier. Brock Bowers had 77 yards receiving, had a rushing touchdown. The defense looked great overall. The only thing I would be upset with, that I'm sure Kirby Smart's upset with, is that they let them get a touchdown.
Yeah, for sure. And just in general, I mean, Georgia came out and they were the better team. I'm excited to see how the defense looks going forward. Obviously, they were going to look great in a game against Tennessee Martin. Not really fair competition there. But I think going forward, this Georgia team has some easy games that they can pile up on, kind of like a team like Notre Dame we talked about earlier. Georgia is just going to be able to build momentum, and then they get into SEC play and things get tough. So right now, it's probably not going to be likely that Georgia moves down in our rankings anytime soon. But either way, really solid squad. Obviously, we expected. They haven't lost a game in what feels like ages. So probably not a lot of movement there until something big happens.
Yeah, it's been a few years since they lost a game. With that being said, though, some big games this week, especially towards the bottom of our rankings. So we'll probably see a lot more movement there. Obviously, the Alabama and Texas game is going to be huge. We both gave our predictions for that. So with all that being said, we'll see you guys next week. We'll have some different predictions then, and we'll see some movement on these tables.
See you guys.